Which film is better, Shin Godzilla or Godzilla Minus One? It's a tough question to answer to what is admittedly a pointless question, as both films are considered masterpieces and essential entries within the Godzilla franchise. Shin Godzilla, released in 2016 and written and directed by Hideaki Anno, is a scathing and patriotic post-3/11 satire of Japanese government bureaucracy in the face of nationwide environmental disasters. That's as much radical as it is traditional in its depiction of the famous atomic monster. Godzilla Minus One, released in 2023 and written and directed by Takashi Yamazaki, is an earnest and heartfelt post-World War II period piece that examines the heart of Japan following the trauma of an event that left the nation and its people in shambles. These two films have been produced in tandem with the Hollywood-made MonsterVerse films, together keeping the Godzilla franchise alive by offering wildly different experiences, with the MonsterVerse films letting the character loose with silly schlocky monster brawls that the whole family can enjoy, while Toho keeps him grounded to his roots with dramatic, character-focused stories that use the monster as a means of exploring more complex themes and ideas. Both Shin and Minus One do this exceptionally well, and in ways that are both very similar and different to each other. And so I thought it would be fun to take a deeper look at these two films and examine how they compare and contrast with each other. Because when you watch them back to back, you quickly realize how they mirror each other in odd and fascinating ways. Whether intended or not, Shin and Minus One are like two twin siblings that carry the same traits, but dress differently and have wildly diverging ambitions. Before I proceed, however, I must reiterate that the goal here is not to definitively declare one better than the other, if such a declaration is even possible. Whether you prefer one or the other depends on your cinematic tastes, and is most likely by degrees, as both are wonderful films worthy of their accolades. Also, this video will contain spoilers for the plots of both films, so if you haven't seen either of them, I suggest you do so before watching. So let's start with the obvious similarities. Both are prestige, award-winning Japan vs. Godzilla films from auteur filmmakers, expressions of a singular vision from an artist with a passion for the character and what he represents. There are no other monsters other than Godzilla, and there are no monster balls of any kind. Godzilla is the antagonist of the films, pushing the plot forward through his destructive acts, forcing the human characters into action if they are to save their nation. Both have almost beat-for-beat similar narrative structures. Godzilla attacks 3 times in both films, with the second major attack in mainland Japan at around the halfway point. He devastates Tokyo with his first spectacular display of his atomic breath, then leaves the film for a long stretch of the second act, giving the characters time to formulate a crazy unorthodox plan to take out Godzilla, which plays out in the third act. And finally, both are patriotic films to a certain extent, featuring stories focused on themes of survival through the unification and out-of-the-box thinking of Japan's citizens. This brings us to the first major difference between Shin and Minus One, that being the scope in which they explore their themes. Shin has a very large scope. Its story is told through the eyes of the Japanese government, and thus we experience the story from a larger picture perspective. Focus is on immediate, and sometimes not so immediate, bureaucratic reaction, which involves legislation, evacuation, and military response, and it's all presented within the prism of a global event. While the perspective of other nations is never outright shown, they are involved in the plot, particularly the United States, who plays a critical role, and whose relationship with Japan is inherent to the themes the story is exploring. Essentially, Shin is a story about Japan within the context of the rest of the world, and as such is a very political film. Its cast is sprawling and consists entirely of politicians with political goals, most of whom are just faces and titles. The closest the film has to protagonists are Rando Yaguchi and Kyoko Ann Patterson, both of which have aspirations to ascend the ladder of government and effect real change, to which they do so by spearheading an effective response to Godzilla. In contrast, Minus One is very insular. The entire concept of the film is about Japan fending for itself against the unstoppable force of Godzilla, who shows up to wreak havoc just as the country is beginning to pull itself up from its lowest point. They are reduced from 0 to Minus One. No other nations are involved, with the US quite literally sitting this one out and saying, "You're on your own, kid." And unlike Shin, Minus One is deliberately not from the government's perspective. Yamazaki goes out of his way to keep the perspective rooted down to the average citizens who are trying to pick up the pieces of their lives and find their place in the world. And so the scope is so much smaller, its considerations more inward focused and intimate. The cast of characters is pretty small, and so we get to know them rather well. The main character, Koichi Shikishima, is a dishonored kamikaze pilot who must push through his sense of misplaced guilt to save Japan from Godzilla, and in doing so, save himself. It's very melodramatic, very introspective. If Shin Godzilla is a more heady film, one viewed more from the outside, from afar, then Minus One is a more emotional film, one experienced up close and personal. which is why it's no surprise audiences of all walks of life responded so positively to it. Despite it being a period piece, its themes are universal, relatable to anyone at any time, while Shin explores issues and themes more rooted to the specific context of our modern time. All this is to say is that the core difference between Shin Godzilla and Minus One is that the former is a more political and less character-driven film, while the latter is a more character-driven and less political film, which surprised me considering the post-World War II setting. While Minus One takes place in a time where Japan had just experienced Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the events that birthed the idea of Godzilla, it doesn't consider those events at all. The themes of nuclear power and the dangers of man-made weapons of mass destruction inherent to Godzilla as an artistic concept are nowhere to be found in Minus One, despite it taking place in a setting rich for exploration. As already mentioned, it is instead focused on personal themes, themes of honor, self-sacrifice, family, PTSD, and the value of life. Godzilla is a stand-in not for nuclear power, but for the general horrors of war itself, as specific or broad as you want it to be. To Koichi specifically, he represents his sense of guilt for his failures as a kamikaze soldier in the war, and in his first encounter with Godzilla. It is only in defeating Godzilla without giving his own life that he can heal from the guilt and begin truly living it. In this way, Minus One is as much anti-war as any other Godzilla film, but it explores this from a very narrow and universal perspective, hence the universal appeal. Shin Godzilla, on the other hand, is wholly and intrinsically political, and its themes very specifically explore modern-day anxieties around nuclear power. It's much more a remake of the 1954 original than Minus One is, because it is meditating on the same things the original did, just in the context of its time. While Gojira was about war and atomic weaponry following World War II, Shin is much more about nuclear power in general in relation to government bureaucracy, environmental disasters, and geopolitics. Just as Hiroshima and Nagasaki informed the worldview of Gojira, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and Fukushima power plant meltdown informed Shin Godzilla, and its considerations are in response to that. And as for radical departure Godzilla is in Shin as far as appearance and abilities go, as a metaphor he is very traditional, standing in for fear of nuclear power. Shin is also very traditional in the fact that it does bring its anxieties back to the specific thing that birthed Godzilla himself, the atomic bomb. The entire third act is about stopping Tokyo from being destroyed not just by Godzilla, but by an atomic bomb, the idea of which is heresy in this film, equally as bad if not worse than Godzilla for the philosophical implications of its use. An atomic bomb once again used on Japanese soil is an affront to the nation, and therefore must be stopped at all cost, because to allow its use is to reopen the wound of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the very wound that gave birth to Godzilla himself. And so in this way, Shin is both its own beast with its own ideas and considerations in the context of its time, while at the same time a mirror of the original film. Shin and Minus One are also extremely different in their filmmaking styles. In fact, they're kind of polar opposites. Shin Godzilla is a very slick, efficient, modern political thriller. It is incredibly fast-paced, and while this works wonders to reflect the urgent manner of the plot, it risks being so overwhelming that it will undoubtedly alienate a certain percentage of viewers. This makes Shin Godzilla more polarizing than Minus One. While it is critically acclaimed in general, and there is a large group of people, including myself, who adore the film, a lot of people simply don't enjoy it. They find it needlessly complex and unwieldy, and if you are someone who needs some kind of an emotional core to anchor you into the story, then Shin can be an unengaging and exhausting experience. In contrast, Minus One is very much a more traditional classical blockbuster, in the vein of Steven Spielberg or James Cameron. Its pace is much slower, and it takes its time to invest you in a small group of characters so that when the action starts, you fear for them, thus getting you emotionally invested. It's much more reminiscent of the kinds of crowd-pleasing blockbusters audiences outside of Japan are familiar with, which was intentional on Toho and Yamazaki's part. It's no surprise then that Minus One experienced near universal acclaim when it was released. It has one of the highest Rotten Tomatoes scores of any movie ever, and nearly everyone who sees it varies from mild enjoyment to downright adoration. Pretty much everyone loves Minus One, from hardcore fans to casuals to those who know nothing about Godzilla, and that's precisely because from its conception it was crafted to have broad appeal, which was a smart move, as Minus One has become the most critically and financially successful Japanese-produced Godzilla film. These stylistic differences are perhaps best reflected in their portrayal of the King of the Monsters himself. Just as Shin Godzilla is attempting to be something more slick and modern, so too is its Godzilla. Aesthetically, he is more grotesque and dehumanizing than ever, constantly evolving into new, more complicated forms, with new, more complicated abilities. Toxic blood leaks from his orifices, infecting everything it touches. His atomic breath is no longer relegated to just his mouth, now he can shoot it out of his back and tail. And the film ends with the suggestion suggestion that Godzilla, if left unchecked, will evolve into some form of Godzilla-human hybrid that could take over the entire planet. These changes are very radical, so much so that they border on blasphemy. The film reaches that fine line of taking things too far but never crosses it, because despite these radical differences, he's still Godzilla through and through. He still does and represents traditional Godzilla things. In fact, his final form is very similar looking to the Keltoid Scar-inspired design from the original film, once again showing how Shin is attempting to balance being different with being familiar. Minus One's Godzilla, like the film that he's in, is a very traditional design, kind of a mix-up of Heisei, Millennium, and Monsterverse designs. This is not to say that Yamazaki doesn't add his own personal touch, but he does within the confines of what you expect Godzilla to look like. He doesn't take major swings with his look or powers, instead enhancing what we already have seen. The closest he gets is with Godzilla's healing abilities, something always assumed but never outright shown until now. Like Minus One itself, it's not so much about making major changes, but doing the expected better than ever before. The film achieves truly awe-inspiring moments with Godzilla, both on land and sea. Basically, while we've seen him swim in the ocean and destroy buildings, it's never looked this good. So what have we learned here at the end of my ramblings? Well, to summarize, Shin Godzilla and Minus One tell essentially the same story, at least in the most superficial, broadest sense. They follow near identical structures, and are told by visionary directors with a deep reverence for the character and its legacy. But it's through the artistic intentions of Anno and Yamazaki that the films diverge in theme, tone, and cinematic style, only to circle back to each other by both becoming award-winning, record-breaking giant monster masterpieces. For all their differences big and small, both films stand tall as essential entries in the long-running Godzilla franchise, pushing it in new but traditionally thoughtful, crowd-pleasing directions that expose it to new audiences. Both films honor Godzilla's legacy in their own way, proving that the King of the Monsters remains as relevant and impactful as ever. So which film resonates with you more? I have my preference, which you can find in the comments below, but I want to hear from you. Let your opinion be known, and let's keep the conversation going. And if you like this video, let the YouTube gods know by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, long live the king.